Here, British shoppers and farmers are growing increasingly concerned about the potential consequences of the government striking trade deals with countries around the world after Brexit. Now, consumer groups are worried that deals with countries like the US and Australia may lead to the erosion of food hygiene and safety standards, which could worsen animal welfare, while UK farmers fear they will be undercut by producers who do not have to adhere to the same rules. We've all heard about chlorinated chicken. What are the main differences, though, between food standards here and the Americans? Professor Erik Millstone is food safety policy expert and emeritus professor of science policy at Sussex University. Erik, afternoon to you, sir. And I
Good
suppose
afternoon.
we should start with chicken, really, because this phrase chlorinated chicken, which nobody ever thought about on their various visits to the US on holiday, eating fried chicken by the bucket load, perhaps, and suddenly now it's become a pejorative term.
Yes, it has, and I think rightly so. The reason why chicken, but also other kinds of meat in the US, beef and pork, and also turkey, is treated with chemical disinfectants is because the conditions in which the animals are reared and slaughtered are far less hygienic than that would be tolerated in the UK. And so as a consequence, the levels of bacterial contamination that can cause very serious food poisoning are much, much higher in North America than they are here on this side of the Atlantic. And there's also something worrying about it, which is a study emerged just over a year ago showing that using chlorinated wash didn't actually kill or significantly slow down the bacteria. All the chlorine wash did was actually block the standard test by which the presence of those dangerous bacteria is normally detected.
Wow.
So it wasn't an effective disinfectant, and it was giving misleading reassurance that food might be safe when in fact it's not. And this almost certainly explains why the rates of food poisoning in North America are very substantially higher than they are on this side of the Atlantic.
So there are a number of concerns then, from animal welfare to cheating a test, which essentially would be the suggestion there. And of course, hygiene factors can be swerved if you throw enough agents at the meat in order to try and eradicate it, albeit temporarily. So there's a number of sort of food crimes going on in that respect. But of course, it's not just chicken, is it? I mean, we talk about chicken because it's hit the headlines, and the phrase chlorinated chicken. There's a world of difference in many other areas of food between us and the States.
There most certainly is. The vast proportion of beef cattle in the US are injected with synthetic growth-promoting hormones, which means for a given amount of food, they gain weight slightly more quickly than would be the case without those hormones. But there are good scientific reasons for thinking that the meat from the animals treated with hormones is not acceptably safe. Similarly, the vast majority of dairy cows in the USA are injected with a synthetic hormone that stimulates lactation, or the process of producing milk. So similarly, you get a marginal decrease in the cost of milk, you get a little more milk for a given amount of feed. But one of the problems is, because more milk is being extracted from those unfortunate cows, they end up with much higher rates of infections of their udder, the condition called mastitis, which gets treated with with antibiotics, and consequently their milk contains residues of the antibiotics. And if you'll forgive me putting it so crudely, because of the infection in the udders, the milk has higher levels of pus than is deemed acceptable on this side of the Atlantic. So that's another respect in which their food standards are poorer. A third one is with pesticides. They permit many more pesticides than deemed acceptable on this side of the Atlantic, and they permit much higher residues than we consider acceptable. And that's just a few examples, but there are many more.
But of course, the Americans do sell elsewhere. I mean, they don't just have a domestic market, and they may have problems with European exports because of those standards, but they sell to other countries. And what one would assume that whilst there might be somebody on the peripheries who are debating these points, the average Australian or New Zealander or Indian or wherever the food goes are merrily eating away with few complaints.
Well, I don't think US meat is being exported to Australia. Australia is a large.
Okay, I say that as an example, okay. But they export.
Or India. No, mostly the products that the US export a lot of staples, wheat, maize, and soybeans, and processed foods. Not a great deal of meat, and not a great deal of milk or dairy products.
Do we need to be worried about those?
Well, I think we should, because the ingredients that goes into those highly processed food products often are produced standards which are significantly lower than those that would apply on this side of the Atlantic. So I'm not saying no US food is acceptably safe, but I am saying that the kinds of foods that the US farm sector and food processing sector is keen to export to Europe are the kinds of products that are substantially produced to significantly lower standards than those which we deem acceptable.
And of course, it doesn't mean, and there's a lot of headlines about this, and there's a lot of politics in those headlines as well, Erik, it doesn't mean that we are going to be filling up every single supermarket with rubbish American food. We will be importing, one has to reasonably assume, from a variety of countries around the world. And it may well also be that it comes to the point where we don't allow some of that American produce in because of the arguments you've made.
That is quite likely. It's interesting that earlier this year, the majority of UK large supermarkets committed themselves to not stocking US beef, US poultry meat, and so on. I think the area into which imported foods are likely to go is the catering trade. Because when you buy a takeaway or you have a meal in a restaurant, you hardly ever have the slightest idea where those ingredients come from. You pick up a packet in a supermarket and there's information on the label.
True.
That's not the case in the catering trade. So I think the lower quality, cheaper products will end up in catering and also institutions, hospitals, schools, prisons, places like that.
Erik, fascinating stuff. Thank you. Nice to have you with us, Professor Erik Millstone, food safety policy expert, formerly of Sussex University, science policy professor there too.